Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm really absolutely delighted to be here this morning. Now, I suspect that some of you are wondering why I have this strange sort of title for my talk. Have I really come here to tell you, as the keynote speaker, not to do knowledge management? Well, actually, no. What I'd like to do is I guess really maybe more share an opinion of mine, an approach of mine to knowledge management. It's more about changing the approach to knowledge management rather than not doing it. I'm not suggesting you don't do it. You know, over the last 15 years or so that I've been involved, in the field, I've probably lost count of the number of times that people have come to me and said, David, how do we do knowledge management? And my usual reply is something like, well, what are you trying to do for the business? What is it you want to achieve? You don't just do knowledge management for its own sake. And they say, well, we want people to share more. Or we want to create a knowledge-driven organization. Or we want to create a learning organization. And I say, yes, that's fine, that's good. But why do you want to do that? What's the purpose? What are you trying to achieve? And more often than not, they can't answer that question. And I've seen a number of organizations, if you will, that have taken this approach of doing knowledge management. And because they're not focused on a business problem or a business opportunity, however small or however broad, they actually fail because of that lack of focus. And so my message is that in many ways we shouldn't be looking to do knowledge management. We should be starting with the problem, starting with the opportunity, starting with the end in mind, as Stephen Covey would say, in terms of what we're trying to achieve. And then simply to see knowledge management as if I can do this up here. How's that? Is that a little better? And then simply to see knowledge management as maybe a set of tools, a set of techniques, methodologies for achieving that end. I sometimes go even further, and I say there are no such thing as a knowledge management initiative or knowledge management strategy, because again, when I hear people talk in those terms, they tend to conceptualize it. They tend to talk about knowledge sharing, but they tend not to talk about the purpose, the reason that they want people to share knowledge. Now, what I'm saying here is a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Clearly you can have a knowledge management strategy, you can have a knowledge management project, but I think the focus has always got to be on the business. And if there's one message that I want to leave with you today, it's exactly that, that you need to focus on the business. Now, as I said a few moments ago, one of the reasons for me coming to this conclusion, if you will, is that the sad fact, really, that most KM projects fail. And that sounds like a very negative message. In some ways it is, but in other ways it isn't. If you think about it, the vast majority of IT projects, and certainly change management projects, fail. Some people say it's as high as 70 or 80%. And what I want to do is, if you like, learn, apply some knowledge management thinking here, and to learn from those mistakes. What is it that makes KM so difficult? Why hasn't KM maybe lived up to its expectations? And I won't read these out, but I've just listed a few of the reasons I think that KM has not done as well as it might. And I think actually one of the biggest reasons, it's one of the toughest projects to undertake almost in the universe. Trying to manage knowledge in an organization, trying to get people to change their behaviors, especially moving from maybe a competitive sort of mental attitude where knowledge is power, to moving to an attitude that sharing knowledge is power, is a big move for many, many people, and it's very difficult at times to achieve. So there are lots of reasons, I think, that things haven't gone so well. And what I want to do for the rest of my session is really just share with you a few thoughts about some of the things that I think we need to do a little differently. Okay? The first thing I want to share with you are 4 what I think are fundamental questions for anybody undertaking some sort of KM project or initiative. So in some ways here, I'm not giving you the answers, I'm giving you the questions that you need to ask yourselves as you tackle a KM project. And they may seem very simple and very obvious questions, but time and time again, I see people who say that they understand the issues, they say they understand these questions, but if you look closely, then they're not actually doing it. So these are the 4 questions. The first one I've really just covered. What are the business problems we're trying to solve? We're not trying to do KM, we're not trying to create a knowledge-sharing organization. What is it we're trying to do for the business? And it's very simple. That, to my mind, is the place that you start. The other thing we need to do is to really ensure that we've got the buy-in of the senior managers in the organization. I think if you haven't got that, by and large, most KM projects will fail, or they'll certainly not have a wide impact on the organization. One of the problems with KM is that it's often to see good results, it takes a long time. It might take a year, it might take 18 months. Again, because of the problems and the challenges, things tend to take a little longer. And unless you've got the buy-in of the senior managers and you've got their sustained support, as soon as maybe there's a downturn in the economy and they're looking to save costs, they're looking to cut heads, KM might well be top of the list. I once heard somebody say that in good times, KM means knowledge management, but in bad times, KM means kill me. And we don't want to go there, do we? So this support from senior management is important. But it's not just the support from senior management. Even maybe more critically is the support and the engagement of the buy-in from the people in the organization. And the problem here is that the managers, the business managers, you can sell to them on business outcomes. Increase revenue, increase profit, reduce cost. But for the vast majority of people in most organizations, they don't even know what the revenue of the organization is. They don't think in terms of revenue and profit and cost. They're not business people. Most of the time, they just want to do a good job. And there are different motivations for people in organizations. As I say, some want to do a good job, some want to get promoted, others want to become experts in their field. They want to become sort of a master in programming or marketing or R&D. They're not interested in the business as such. And so you've got to sell to them and get their buy-in in fundamentally different ways. So you've got to think about that. How do we get the buy-in from the people in the organization to make this project a success? And last but not least, and this one often gets forgotten and doesn't get sufficiently thought about, how do we demonstrate that our KM initiative has been successful? And you've almost got to do that on a daily basis. You've always got to think about this. Are we demonstrating very clearly to the senior managers that we're being successful, and to the people in the organization? Because if it's not clear, again, you're in danger of being killed. So this is part of what I want to do this morning. We just leave you with these 4 questions to think about, if you're initiating any KM project. But let's move on and share with you a few more thoughts. The first one is to think for yourselves. And I don't really mean to be sort of condescending or insulting here. I think at times all of us, we tend to fall into a pattern of wanting to follow a recipe. We're looking for a prescription. I often get asked by people, again, that same question, David, how do you do KM? And I start to talk about some of the things I've just talked about. And they say, no, you don't understand, David. How do you do it? What are the 5 steps? Just tell me the 5 steps that I can follow to do KM. And I'm saying, I'm sorry, but KM isn't like that. It is so contextually dependent that you can't give 5 steps. What will work for one organization won't work for another. What will work for one individual won't work for another. What will work today in your organization won't work next month in your organization because things are continually changing. You've got to be very, very aware of the context that you're working in and adapt your approach appropriately. So, there are no recipes or prescriptions. There are no simple sets of steps. I mean, there are frameworks, there are models, there are things that can help you, there are principles that can help you. But don't go looking for best practices or prescriptions. You will find them, but by and large, if you follow them, again, you're probably likely to fail. As I say, it's very contextually dependent. Each of you, as a manager, is different. Your industry is different. Your organization is different. Your politics are different. There's so much variation, and all these things are changing, almost on a daily basis, and especially as the world speeds up. So there are no recipes. Don't go looking for recipes. There's no substitute for actually thinking for yourself. Now, I want to say a little bit more about focusing on the business. Because it may seem that I'm over-accentuating this, but I think it's absolutely critical. Many of you will be familiar with this gentleman, Albert Einstein. Some years ago, he said that if he were given 60 minutes to save the world, he would spend the first 55 minutes defining and understanding the problem. Because once he understood the problem, he could save the world in the last 5 minutes. And I think there's a great deal in that. The problem is, by and large, we're too quick to jump to the answer, to jump to the conclusion, to jump to the solution before we have really understood what it is that we're trying to achieve. I had a young woman manager email me a few years ago, and she said, David, could you help me? I'd like to know some of the best techniques for capturing people's knowledge when they leave an organization. And I mailed her back and I said, you need to tell me a little bit more. I'd like a little bit more context. And she said, well, we've got a department and the turnover rate, the attrition rate, is 70%. 70% of the people in the department were leaving each year. And she said, I want to capture their knowledge before they leave. Now, I wasn't convinced if they'd only been with the company for maybe less than a year that they had much knowledge to actually capture. But what I said to her was, are you sure you're tackling the right problem here? Is the problem the loss of knowledge, or is the problem actually the loss of the people? Maybe rather than trying to capture their knowledge, you should be trying to increase your retention rate. You should be trying to figure out what it is that's causing them to leave so quickly and keep them longer. And I think that's a very simple example. But again, in our organizations, it's awfully easy to jump to the solution without really thinking hard about the problem and what it is you really, really want to achieve for the business. Just said that. Now let's get back to this whole concept of business outcomes. Often when I ask people what they're doing, They don't tell me that, we're helping to solve a problem in manufacturing, or we're trying to improve revenue, by increasing sales or what have you. They tell me things that to do with the activity. They say, we're setting up some communities of practice, or we've implemented a knowledge management database. They always talk to me in terms of activity, not in terms of what they're doing for the business. So what I say is, people who will not share the knowledge is not a business issue. Implementing a knowledge-sharing system is not a business outcome. On the other hand, slowness to market of new products is a business issue. Shortening the time to market for a new product is a business outcome. It's these business outcomes that we need to focus on. Here's some more examples. Doing KM is not a business outcome. Creating a learning organization is not a business outcome. And so on. Business outcomes are about cutting costs, improving profit, improving quality, reducing staff turnover, and so on. This is what we need to be critically focusing on all the time. Because if we don't, as knowledge managers, knowledge practitioners, we are in serious danger. So a little bit about outcomes. Something else I get asked, and it was really quite interesting, yesterday. I have a knowledge management forum on LinkedIn, where people can come and they can discuss knowledge management issues. It's got over 2,000 members. And Marina Hiscock, who's a knowledge management practitioner in South Africa, she posted the question, if you've just been given the job to do KM, what's the very first thing you would do? And I haven't checked this morning, but there may be 30, 40 or 50 replies from various people around the world suggesting the best thing to do. But I got in there quite early, and I gave my answer. This is what I always say to people when they ask me this question. I would go to the CKO, so the CEO of the organization, and I would simply ask, what is it that keeps you awake at night? What's your biggest problem? What's your biggest issue? What's your biggest challenge? Figure that out. Talk to the senior managers as well. What are their problems? What are their issues? What are the serious issues? Literally, what's keeping them awake at night? And then take a look and see how KM can help them solve those problems. Because if you can do that, you're going to be a hero. You're going to have the support of the CEO and senior managers. If you work a lot lower in the organization, yes, it can work there, but you don't want to be working on something that you feel is important, but say the senior managers don't. So often what I say here is, your job is to make sure that the CEO gets a good night's sleep. Your job is to put the CEO to sleep. But yes, I think that's what I want to say about business issues. Now, yet another point I want to make. Some years ago, I was at a conference, and we had a good speaker, a guy called Bob Buckman. I actually mentioned him later. And he gave a talk, and at the end of the talk, a young woman in the audience, she said, "Bob, we've just implemented a knowledge management system in our organization, but nobody will use it. How do we make them use it?" That was a question. Not how do we encourage them, but how do we make them? Almost how do we force them to use it? And Bob gave an answer. I can't remember quite what it was now. But then the rest of the audience started to join in. And they were saying things like, you need to motivate them. They need to be incentivized. You need to offer them air miles. You need to give them presents and prizes. You need to hold little drawers. You need to find all sorts of ways to incentivize them to use the system. And I'm sitting there thinking, there's something wrong. We don't do this in other areas of the business. Why should we be bribing people to use the system? Because that's the way I saw it. It To me, it just looked like bribery and manipulation rather than, incentivization. And so as the hubbub died down, I came in and I asked my question. I said, could you tell me to what extent you involved the people in the design and the development, even the conceptualization of the system? And do you know what she said? She said, we didn't involve them at all, which was absolutely amazing. And she saw the sort of look of horror on my face. And she said, management wanted the system yesterday. We didn't have time to involve them. So there was no buy-in. They hadn't been part of it. It was being forced on them. They were doing things to the people rather than working with them. And I'm pretty sure that no amount of incentivization and goodies was going to maybe change these people's attitude. I should think they were probably quite annoyed and quite upset that the system was being foisted on them without, taking any of their input, without taking the time to listen to them at all. In many ways, it was showing gross disrespect to the people in the organization. This gentleman, Alfie Cone, is actually an American educationalist. And he says this: an innovative, healthy organization requires that we work with people rather than do things to them. I think that sums it up very, very nicely. This whole business about motivation, I don't think really that we can motivate people. I think if we're trying to motivate people, what we're really trying to do is manipulate them. Motivation, to my mind, is inherently intrinsic. People have got to find it for themselves. And I think if you try to incentivize and motivate people, you actually have a pushback. They realize what you're doing, and they don't like it. You think about it yourself when you know that somebody is maybe being very nice to you, heaping praise on you, but you know that they're not being totally sincere. They're trying to get you to do something that they want you to do. You resist. Now this brings me on into the whole topic, the whole arena of rewards. And what I want to say to you now is something that is quite controversial, and I think many, many of you in the room will actually disagree with what I've got to say. You'll probably feel actually quite uneasy about it. And to be fair with you, at times I struggle with it as well. Coming back to Alfie Cone again, what Alfie says is that research shows that giving rewards, even praise, actually results in worse performance and undermines intrinsic motivation. It seems that all the behavioral research from the last 30 years shows that other than in very limited circumstances, rewarding people to do anything has an adverse effect, not a positive effect. Just think about that. Even if you don't agree, and I'm sure many of you won't, just imagine for a moment that it might be true. Imagine what we've been doing all these years. We've been rewarding people, thinking we're improving performance, but in reality, we've been negating the performance. I think that's it's a rather horrible thought, actually, to think that we may have been inadvertently doing that. Now, I don't want you to take my word necessarily for it, and I don't have time to share all the research with you. What I suggest you do, if I've piqued your sort of curiosity here, is take a look at two books. The first is by Alfie Cone himself, called Punished by Rewards. And he's done a lot of work in the education system about how rewards tend to punish school children rather than reward them. But there's a much more recent book by a gentleman called Dan Pink. It's called Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. That book is about a year old. You will find a lot of reviews of the book on the web. You will find a lot of videos of Dan talking about his ideas. Now, let's just take Dan. What he's done is gone and looked at the research. And what he's doing in the book is sharing the research with you that explains why rewards don't work. And let me just share just one of the pieces of research. And I think this is quite a telling story. In this behavioral research, they effectively took two groups of people. So let's take two of those people. And they give them a puzzle to solve. And they're given 10 minutes to solve the puzzle. Now the puzzle's been set up so you can't actually solve it. They're not going to solve it in the 10 minutes. One person, they give them the 10 minutes and they tell them if they solve the puzzle, they will give them 1,000 dirhams as a reward. The other person, they just ask them to solve the puzzle. They take the 10 minutes, both of them fail to solve the puzzle. They then say to them, we're not quite ready for the next test. Could you just sit and wait in the room for 15 minutes while we prepare? They then observe them through a hidden camera. And this is the magic or the tragedy, if you will. The person who was not offered the reward, they carry on trying to solve the puzzle. They're still curious. They're still driven to solve the puzzle. On the other hand, the person that was given the reward, they cast the puzzle to one side, they get up, they walk around the room, they look out the window, they read a magazine. They've lost interest in the puzzle. What's happened is that the reward has effectively destroyed their intrinsic motivation to solve the puzzle. Their attitude is, it's too late. I can't win the reward now. Why bother with the puzzle? And so they don't. And what these people are saying is that the problem with the rewards is that the rewards replace the goal itself. The rewards replace the goal. That's what people start to strive for rather than doing a good job. And there are story after story after story that demonstrate that sort of destruction of motivation. So even if you're still not too sure and you're interested, go take a look at either of these books. In Punished by Rewards, Alfie lists some of the reasons that he thinks rewards are a bad thing. That they punish, that they rupture relations, they ignore reasons, they deter risk-taking, and they undermine interest. And he elaborates on each of those. I've added one more. Rewards are gamed. I've seen this many, many times in the KM field where people are given rewards for maybe putting things into KM systems. And people find ways to cheat because now they're after the goodie. They're not interested in contributing to the system. They do the minimum that they've got to do. They cheat. They get together with their friends, and often there's voting systems and things, and they rig the voting so that this month I get the reward, and next month, say, Ron gets the reward. So there's a lot of reasons why rewards don't work. But then, of course, the question is, if traditional extrinsic rewards don't work, then what does? And certainly in the field of knowledge management. I want to share with you, if you like, some thoughts of different people. Alfie Cone puts it out quite bluntly. He says, pay people well, pay them fairly, get out of their way, and let them get on with their job. That's Alfie's response. Oh, he says this as well, which I rather like, that loving what you do is a far more powerful motivator than any goodie, including money. Bob Buckman, who's sort of one of the granddaddies of KM, if you haven't come across Bob, go Google him on the web. He did a lot of amazing work back in the 90s. He says, knowledge sharing is your job. Just do it. And if you do, as a reward, you may get to keep your job. I rather like that one as well. I think that gets to the point. And Dan Pink, in his book, the book's in two parts. The first half of the book, he explains why rewards don't work. In the second half of the book, he addresses the question, so what does work? What does motivate us? And again, he's looking at the research. He's not just speculating. And it seems that the behavioral scientists have identified three things that pretty much motivate all of us. The first is autonomy. That's the more control we've got over what we do and the way we do things, the more intrinsically motivated we are to do the job. Again, you can see in our organizations, you can't always do that to a huge degree. But we see organizations like Google who will give their employees, nominally 1 day a week to do what they want. I'm not necessarily suggesting that you do that, but that's an interesting story and sort of well worth looking at and thinking about. How can you give your employees, your team, whoever, more autonomy? Secondly, mastery. I think all of us have got this kind of very deep in us, the need to master our topic. Maybe we're a marketeer, and we want to become the best marketeer in the world. Or a computer programmer, we want to become the best programmer. So many of us want to do, are driven to do a really good job in our field. And so the more opportunities we can give people in the organization for this personal mastery is again key to motivating people. And last but not least, and probably the more difficult of all of them, is purpose. If people feel that they're working to a higher purpose, a purpose other than to make money, they tend to be more driven and more motivated. That can be a difficult one in many organizations where the sole purpose really is to make money. It's a little easier if you're an NGO or maybe public sector where you're providing a public service. There can be a higher purpose. But it seems it's these three things that fundamentally motivate people. And it's these three things we should be thinking about when we're thinking about, quote-unquote, rewarding people. Kind of just drawing to a close now. This is pretty much my last slide. And what I thought I would do was leave you with some questions rather than leave you with some answers. I hope I've talked enough about things so that you're taking something sort of substantive away from this talk. But, if you're looking at KM and you're looking to do KM, these are just some of the questions you need to be asking yourself, again, almost on a daily basis. I won't read those out. Most of them I've touched on during my talk. Now, according to my little timer on my pointer here, I've got 13 minutes or so left. What I want to do is something that unlike most speakers, I do something a little bit different. And it's this. I'm happy to take some questions and answers in a moment. But before I do that, what I'd like you to do at your tables is just in your small groups, just turn to each other and have a conversation around my talk. Just share with each other some of your thoughts and views. Maybe the one about rewards. Did what I have to say impress you, or were you not convinced? I just want to give you maybe 3 or 4 minutes just to have a simple little conversation and engage with each other. And then I'll take some questions. Happy to do that? Okay. Over to you for 3 or 4 minutes.